All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll pray for us. Father, I pray you help us today. We're in the midst of studying a difficult text, and we believe that you are a great communicator, and we want to think your thoughts after you. And we confess that we're unequal to the task, so would you help us today? Would you help us see clearly what's in your word? Would you give us good research skills? And I pray in all of it, Lord Jesus, that you would be honored. For it's in your name that we pray. Amen. So I put a link in Brightspace that links all the documents. So if you go to the Brightspace, I put a link to the folder. It has the actual updated document, so don't think you have to write anything down. And where we are is we've come to this phrase, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And this coming of the Son of Man is the Greek word parousia. So will be the parousia of the Son of Man. And this word parousia has been the subject of massive debate in the Christian church. What exactly does it mean? Does it mean Jesus coming in judgment invisibly in 70 A.D.? Does it mean Jesus coming in judgment visibly at the end of the world? What does it mean? So that's what we're going to look at today. And I'm going to walk you through kind of what I do, and you'll have access to the notes, and so you can see. I've been up front that I kind of lean partial preterist. I think this is talking about a judgment in 70 A.D., but I tell people I hold that view with an open hand. I'm not certain it's right. That's just the way I lean. And I want to examine, is this even a possibility? I mean, has anybody even held that view before? And so the first thing that I do is I'm going to go to a concordance, BibleWorks, Logos. You can get the free one. Matthew 24:27. I'm just going to look up and see where does the word parousia appear. And what we're going to find is that it occurs about 28 times. The root of the word means something like presence or coming. And it's used of the parousia of Christ at the end of time in the New Testament. And want to be just totally upfront. Partial preterists are not hyper-preterist. That is, hyper-preterism believes that 70 A.D. was it. There's nothing else. That's not an orthodox view. Partial preterism thinks there was a coming in judgment, and then there's going to be a final coming. So partial preterists affirm historic creeds that, the Apostles' Creed, we believe, in the final judgment, the coming Acts 1 is clear in the same way that you see the Son of Man ascending, Son of Man will return. So there's no question that Jesus will come back visibly, physically, the same way he left, he's coming back. The question is that what this passage is talking about? And so I'm going to look up all the passages, and when I do that, I'm still where I was before. It could be the end. Certainly there are passages that use parousia that way. But is that what this is talking about? So when I get to this point, I start looking for help from other people that I trust. This is where I start doing secondary sources. The word doesn't really appear in the Old Testament, so I can't really do that. I'm going to start looking to people that I've learned to trust over the years and see what do they say. And you've heard me say before that the shortest pencil is better than the longest memory. So what I do is I try to take really good notes, because I know that on a difficult passage, it's not like I'm going to remember everything I did, right? You research this stuff long enough, and you're going to research so much, there's no way you can remember it all. And so I've come up with a way to keep good notes, and I do that by using headings. So this is heading 1, and that way I can navigate and I can move these things around. This for me is heading 2, and so it's a way to organize my notes. And so this is what we have, and I can just make it bigger for us here. What have people said about the parousia? And I can tell you through being a researcher now for 35 plus years, or however long it's been, I don't think anybody's better than John Gill. John Gill intellectually runs circles around most people. John Gill's the guy who had been dead forever, and Spurgeon was afraid to pastor the church John Gill had pastored, because Spurgeon thought, I'll never live up to John Gill. John Gill is the guy. I still don't know how he did it. I can do some of what Gill did with a computer. He did it with books. I mean, that blows my mind to me. But this is what he says about the passage. The eastern part of the horizon, and shines even to the western part of it, with great clearness in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, filling the whole intermediate space. So shall the parousia of the Son of Man be, which is understood not of his last coming to judgment. Now, right there, I realize that my leaning, hey, is this talking about the end of the world, or is it talking not about the end of the world? Gill is saying it's not talking about the end of the world. That kind of piques my interest. Though that will be sudden, visible, and universal. He will at once come to and be seen by all in the clouds of heaven, and not in deserts and secret chambers, nor of his spiritual coming in a more sudden, clear, and powerful preaching of the gospel over the Gentile world. That's what a lot of church fathers were trying to interpret this passage to say that it's some kind of spiritual coming. For this was done before the destruction of Jerusalem. So Gill's taking it the same way we've kind of started leaning. Hey, this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But his coming in wrath and vengeance to destroy that people, their nation, city, and temple, so that after this to look for the Messiah in the desert secret chamber must argue great stupidity and blindness when his coming was sudden, visible, powerful, general to the destruction of the nation, as the lightning comes from the east and in a moment shines even to the west. That was one sentence. In one sentence, he's just shown he's mastered the history of interpretation of this passage, and he's given you exactly what he thinks. And it's exactly where I came to independently. So I think I may be on to something. It's not like this is some kind of wacko view. I mean, John Gill articulated it almost exactly the same way I would. Another person that I've come to trust over the years is a guy named R.T. France. And having been in research, 3 decades, I've researched enough hard passages to know that France is somebody that I can trust. He's an incredible scholar. And just as an aside, before he died, he was an incredible man. I remember one time I went to a conference at Oxford University in England, and if you've ever been around somewhere like Oxford, it's a very prideful place. At Oxford, people will tell you all the time, you're the best of the best. This is the best university of the world. And a lot of people kind of buy into that and kind of have egos that will match that kind of statement. And I remember it's just this like nobody postgraduate student going from Sheffield to Oxford. And Sheffield, where I went, so they call it a red brick university. It's not on the same level as Oxford and Cambridge. And so here I am, this lowly postgraduate student coming to this Oxford conference, and R.T. France at that point was the overseer, I think, of Ridley Hall in Oxford. N.T. Wright had some connection with Ridley Hall at one time, but anyway, I go to this conference and I sign in, and the guy signing all of us in is R.T. France. And like I had been reading R.T. France for a long time, I thought, wow, I get to meet R.T. France. And so I'm there, and I sign in. And he said, let me show you your room. And so, he takes me to this, traditional quadrangle, Oxford student room, like you see in C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or something, and so I'm feeling like $1 million, right? And, so we go, and he says, "Can I carry your bags?" And I didn't even know what to say. Here I'm this nobody postgraduate student, and this world-class scholar wants to carry my suitcase to my room for me, and he did. And that just kind of humble, serving person he was. I love the guy. Totally. I think R.T. France is just fantastic scholar. This is what he says about the parousia. This verse is sort of an aside which draws a sharp distinction between the events during this siege and the still future parousia. The real parousia, when it comes, will not be like the claims of the impostors during the siege. So France is recognizing that there's something about Matthew 24 that's about Jerusalem. The 4, which introduces this saying, indicates how it fits into the context. Don't believe them because, in contrast with the so-called Messiah who has to be sought out in an obscure place, who needs authenticating signs to convince people of his claim, the parousia of the Son of Man will be as unmissable as a flash of lightning which blazes across the sky. This warning was perhaps prompted by the disciples' question in verse 3, which, while differentiating the parousia and the end of the age from these things, so he's pointing out in Matthew, it does seem that they're asking three questions: temple, destruction, and then parousia, has nevertheless suggested some association between the two events, that is, the destruction of the temple and the end of the world, probably presupposing that one cannot occur without the other. Not so, says Jesus. The time of the siege and capture of the city will be characterized by claims and counterclaims of those which pretend to a messianic role, but the parousia of the Son of Man will need no such things or proofs. Everyone will recognize it, as he will go on to spell out in verses 36 through 44. He is thus setting the parousia and the end of the age decisively apart from the coming of the destruction of the temple. So France, whom I just totally admire, he's coming down on a different place than John Gill. He's saying that there's a differentiation, although in the disciples' mind they may have been connected. He's saying there's a differentiation between the parousia and the destruction of the temple. He is thus setting the parousia and the end of the age decisively apart from the coming destruction of the temple. The one may be seen coming and prepared for. That is what verse 15 and following have been about. But the other will carry no prior warning. So the disciples' request for a sign for his parousia was misguided, unlike the offer of signs by messianic pretenders. Son of Man will give no warning sign of his parousia. There is no sign that lightning will come, but when it comes, no one can escape the sudden illumination. So the mention of the parousia in this context is intended precisely to distinguish it from the events currently being considered. It will be only after marked change of subject in verse 36. And what we're going to see, once you get to 36, it does seem that Jesus is talking about the end of the world. We're going to see that the parousia will itself come into focus. So I've got two people that I trust, and they come down on two different places. That lets me know this is a hard passage. We're in good company if we're struggling. Good people struggle with this. Then what I do when I do my research is I start looking at people that I know will disagree with me, because I don't want to just kind of have a self-serving, I want to try to make the case, best case I can one way. I want to try to make the best case against what I think. So I found a Catholic commentary on Holy Scripture, and this is kind of a study Bible kind of notes. And it says this: the lightning image suggests suddenness, which might forbid reference to the destruction of the temple, which 15 gives warning of its approach. Yet the argument is not conclusive, since the suddenness is not such as to exclude a period of activity for pseudo-messiahs, 24. And the lightning image is used by the prophets. Didn't know that. Isaiah 30:27, Zechariah 9:14, and of divine judgments in the course and not at the end of history. The coming, parousia, 3, note of the Son of Man is therefore not necessarily, and this should be a coming. That was a typo in Logos, believe it or not. For the final and universal judgment. Notice they're using the English spelling for judgment. It drives me crazy that we differ in spelling in lots of words. It may be his coming for judgment on Israel. So he's agreeing with Gil, or at least he's saying, so here I kind of have a hostile witness, what I thought would be a hostile witness, and he's coming down the same place Gil came down. Another guy or research that I usually differ with, but nevertheless respect, is the Lexham work in Logos. They tend to be much more higher critically oriented than I do, but I'm going to look at what they say because I want to know. This comparison of difference between the time of the temple's destruction and the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the age serves to separate and differentiate these events from each other. So Lexham is agreeing with France. So I've got Gill and the Catholic Study Bible, Lexham in France. All those are great resources, but they're coming down different places. I did not have time to work through this resource yet, and so we're not going to go through it in class. But somewhere I nearly always go is to a resource, and you can find this for free on the internet, called the Catena Aurea. So what is the Catena Aurea? Catena Aurea means the golden chain. And it was done by Thomas Aquinas. Most people put Aquinas right up there. You know, if you're talking about Augustine, he's kind of once you get out of the apostolic age, he's kind of the most influential person on the church history, first 1,000 years. Second 1,000 years, most influential person is, most people say Martin Luther, Okay. Aquinas is that same level between the two. That's kind of how he's the go-to guy for tons of people. And Thomas Aquinas did a work called the Catena Aurea on all four Gospels, where he just looked at the Gospel text and then read every commentary that was available to him and picked out the good quotes. Now think about that. We have one of the top 3 interpreters of the Bible in the first 2,000 years of interpretation. And he's gone through and done a history of interpretation, and he's picked out the ones that he thinks is important. How helpful do you think that would be as a resource? Because I could do that same thing with any passage. It would just take me 3 months, and I would have to get help with the Latin, and I'm not sure I have access to all the books, or I can have one of the top 3 intellectuals the first 2,000 years do it for me. Which one do you think you would, because if we use his, we can do the same work in 25 minutes that would take 3 hours per passage. I don't know about you, but I'll tell you, it gets my vote, Catena Aurea. That's why I go to the Catena Aurea all the time. And we won't read the notes, but he read a Chrysostom, Jerome, Hilary, Augustine from a different work, Gregory, Origen, Gregory, Rambanus, Gregory again, Hilary, Chrysostom again, Jerome, Hilary, Jerome, Gregory, Jerome. All of these to this one verse we're looking at. Augustine, Jerome, Origen, Jerome. I just found a way where I can access the treasury. And all I have to remember is Catena Aurea. Because if I go to Google and type in Catena Aurea, it's going to give me a digital copy. That I can cut and paste and put in my notes. I love this work so much that even though it's free on the internet, I bought it in Logos because it'll footnote it for me. And I love to research, but I'm lazy. If there's a way to do it where I don't have to type everything in, so I paid the $60 or $100 or whatever it was, and I got the Catena Aurea, and I use it all the time. Because not only does it footnote it for me, it also gives me the ages and who these people were and when they wrote. Now I don't have to look it up in Google, right? Catena Aurea is a fantastic tool. I hope you find it as helpful as I've found it helpful over the years. The Hermeneia series, I nearly always disagree with the Hermeneia. This is a German higher critical work. Their assumptions about the Bible are completely different from mine. But Germans are really good researchers. And so I always read Hermeneia because it's going to give me a different perspective from what I would just think about on my own. And Lutz is interesting because he says, verse 27 turns upside down not only the psychological internalizing of the parousia. A lot of the church fathers talk about the coming being this kind of psychological coming of Jesus coming to you in salvation. It was popular to interpret the lightning flash as the gospel that spread through the whole world with wondrous speed and now is shining with divine power. Maldonado sees this interpretation as notoriously self-serving, and he regards it as one of the many errors of the Calvinists. Okay, so I'm a Calvinist, so he's saying only wacko Calvinists believe stuff like that. So, okay, touche, but that's why I read him. I want to get the best argument. Indeed, it does appear occasionally in Protestant interpreters. However, it is much older than just Protestantism. First of all, lightning flash of truth was part of Origen's spiritual interpretation. I didn't know that. I would have known it if I read Aquinas, but I haven't gotten down that list yet. But lets me know that that's a possibility. Then Augustine enlisted in the service of the church and contrasted it with the secret doctrines of the heretics that were preached in the deserts and chambers. And then Lutz says exegesis as self-legitimate. So German higher critic is saying, look at what those stupid conservative Christians believe. I'm not sure if I were a German higher critic that I would criticize conservative Christianity. I don't know, but it's there. ICC is another one I typically disagree with. So there are two different versions. I look at both. So I found that there are supporters for the view that I'm leaning toward, and there are people who are saying that view is wrong. So what I want to do is try to make the case for partial preterism. So I'm not convinced this is right, but I'm trying to be a lawyer, make the best case you can for one, make the best case you can for another. So this is the case I would make for partial preterism. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the context is about the destruction of the temple. We saw that when we went through. these are the verses that show that's true. The question of the disciples are about the end of the temple in Matthew and Luke. Mark's word fulfilled, when will these things be fulfilled? I mean, you can hear soon to lestai. That's almost the same word as Matthew's soon to leia. I mean, one's a verb and one's a noun, but it's the same idea. And Mark is only talking about the temple. He's not talking about the end of the world. So the fact that he's using that technical word makes me wonder if soon to leia has the same kind of impact that the English word culmination of the age has. If Matthew is interpreted in light of Mark and Luke, then the coming and end of the age is about the end of the temple. Mark has the same idea when he speaks of the end in 13:7. We saw that when we read through. Preterist, and when I use the term preterist, I'm talking about partial preterism, not full preterism. I should probably change that in these notes, but partial preterist knows the phrase end of the age appears in Hebrews with the idea that it already has happened. That's significant. 9:26. So this is the exact phrase that appears in Matthew. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world, but as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age. Epi sunteleia ton ion known. That's the precise phrase in Matthew. And Hebrews is saying Jesus appeared at the sunteleia of the age. That makes me wonder if when I hear culmination of the age in English, I'm hearing it the same way that Matthew intended it. And I'll just give you an aside here. I've told some of you this story before, but when I studied in England, I remember having a conversation with this girl one time about the phrase quite pretty. So we were talking, and I said, well, in America, if you say someone's quite pretty, what you mean is there's this category of pretty, right? And this person is way into that category. If I said to my wife, you look quite pretty tonight, the only way she's going to take that is as a compliment. Well, this English girl just swore to me that if you said to an English girl, you look quite pretty, that what you meant is there was a category of pretty, and she was almost into that category. And for the life of me, I've never, I can't work that out in my mind, but I think there's a hint of that. If you've ever seen Pride and Prejudice in the British BBC version, has anybody seen that? You know the mean, ugly sisters that are always after Elizabeth. You know who I'm talking about? I've forgotten their names. I think they're Darcy's sisters or something. I think if a character like that said, oh, you look quite pretty, can you hear? That's what we would mean if we said, you look pretty-ish. I still don't think that that's a fair interpretation of the word. But this English girl just swore up and down that every English person who heard the term quite pretty, that's how they would interpret it. Can you see the difficulty then if you were reading a book, say, 2,000 years from now? And in the book, a male character came in the room and said to a woman, you look quite pretty today. And in the book, the woman slaps the man. Would it make a difference if the writer of that were an American writer or an English writer? If if the writer is an English writer, then the woman is slapping the man because he is insulting her, right? If it's an American writer and the woman slaps the man like she's a psycho, like he's giving her a compliment and like she's just so Looney Tunes that she slaps him for. Do you see how it's not what words mean to me, it's what words mean to the audience? That's what I'm getting at. So the question for me is, does this scintillate of the age mean to the original audience the end of the world? Hebrews 9:26 makes me wonder if it does. In English, it absolutely does. You start talking about the consummation of the age, the only thing it can mean is the end of the world. But clearly it doesn't mean that in Hebrews 9:26. The scintillate of the ages is when Jesus appeared. Are you with me there? Or am I making sense about that argument? So preterists, and I mean partial preterists, also note that the phrase coming, when used of God, absolutely can mean his invisible coming in judgment. This is massive, okay? Josephus was alive when Matthew wrote Matthew. This is what Josephus says. And while all the rest of the air was clear, there came strong winds that raised up heavy showers of rain, which became a mighty tempest. There was also such lightning as was terrible to those who saw it, and thunder and its thunderbolts were sent down and declared, Tain Perusian tu Theou, and declared the presence of God in a gracious way to such as Moses desired he should be gracious. This is talking about God at Mount Sinai, and it's talking about the parousia of God. That seems interesting to me. Josephus, Antiquities 3:203. The sky was clear, there was mist over the tabernacle only, surrounding it, but not very such a very deep and thick cloud as seen in the winter season, nor yet in so thin a one as one might be able to discern anything through it. But from it there dropped sweet dew, and such a one as showed Perusian Theou, such as made visible the parousia of God. They're not seeing a visual, they're seeing something that shows that God is there. That seems significant. Josephus, Antiquities 9:55, and he encouraged him and bade him not to be afraid, but to despise the enemy and to trust the assistance of God, and was himself without fear, and he besought God to make manifest to his servant his power and presence as far as was possible, in order that the inspiring him with hope and courage. Accordingly, God heard the prayer of the prophet. So this is Elisha praying that the eyes of his servant might be opened. And notice what it says, to make evident his dunamis and his parousia. It has to be presence there. And the epistle to Diognetus, this is after Matthew. These look not like the works of a man. They are the power God, they are proofs of his parousia. All those would argue against saying that the word parousia must refer to a visible bodily. So I don't know. I'm going to make the best case I can. That seems significant to me. I want to be under the Bible, not over the Bible. But I also want my allegiance to be to the Bible and not to the tradition of men. If there's something in my denomination that we believe that is unsupported in the Bible, I want to go with the Bible. I want, the Reformers used to say, semper reformanda. Things ought always to be being reformed, I think is what that means. And that's what I want to believe. So I don't know. This seems like a pretty strong case to me. The context, beginning to end, is you, which in the context is Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Those are the four people he was talking to. And it's odd to me if the vast majority of the verses aren't really about anything to do with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Whenever you see the abomination, that supposes that they would see the abomination. But notice in 13:26 it does shift to they will see the parousia. We haven't gotten to this point in the harmony, but we'll go ahead and do this. The discourse includes the words, "This generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled." Mark has that, Matthew has that, Luke has that. A lot of people will point out that the word generation is the word genos in Greek. And they'll point out that genos can also mean race. And so many people will say it's not saying that within a generation, it's saying that this race of people will not cease. The problem with that view is that the same exact words, this generation, those two words appear in Matthew 23 about the wicked generation that is opposing Jesus. Truly, truly, I say to you, all these things will come on this generation. Now, if Jesus died in 30 AD, that's the date I go with and a lot of people go with. He died on Passover in 30 AD. Yom Kippur in 70 AD, which is 40 years and 6 months later, is when the temple was destroyed. That makes perfect sense to me if Jesus is saying this generation will not pass away until all these things. Our archaeologists have actually found the high priest house, and there's stones that were part of his house. And the stones, I don't know if you knew this, but if you get fire hot enough, did you know like you can burn concrete and limestone? Did you know that? I poured a beautiful patio on my house and put some charcoal there as soon as we could walk on it, and it burned a hole in the concrete. Did you know that if you get fire hot enough? I didn't know it either, obviously. But you can. And like we've got the high priest's house, the stones of it are burned because they got the fire so hot when they were destroying. That makes sense. Jesus is saying to the high priest and his followers, all these things will come on this generation. And this generation means those living then, not a future generation. This is confirmed by this generation elsewhere in the Bible. Go into the ark, for I have seen you are righteous before me in this generation. And you can see it's everywhere. So to come to a passage which is much later in the discourse that says, take my words to the bank, everything I've just told you about will come on this generation. I have a hard time making that about a future generation when Jesus' words seem to be saying, look, within 40 years this is going to happen. The content of Jesus' warning shows he's not talking about the end of the world, because he says don't believe anyone who says Christ is here or there. Look, at least my understanding of Jesus' physical coming, it's like Jesus comes, we're like in heaven with Jesus. I don't think people are going to say, did the second coming happen? It's like, yeah, dead people are alive. We're standing in the presence of God. I'm pretty sure that the second coming happened. But Jesus is talking about something where people are going to say, go out in the desert and see. So, I don't know. That may not be a strong argument, but I thought about it. The historical situation favors a 70 AD interpretation. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he should not, let the readers flee to the mountains. We've seen from Eusebius the case for the Christian flight to Pella. And I did get a picture. It would help if I would do this. That's not good. Is this the right one? Yeah. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by vultures, and we saw that word as eagles, get out, right? So, I think I've just hung this up again. Maybe not. Yeah, so the historical situation, Luke spells it out. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, note the historical situation of profaning the temple and the siege of Jerusalem. If I were doing this on my own, I would probably go to Josephus and get his account of how the Zealots fortified the temple and used it as a castle during the siege. I think most people would say that's a fair interpretation of the desolation of the temple. But one of the things that really swayed me, and I remember when I was teaching Greek at Trinity, I had a student who came up to me, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was a graduate student. It was like the very first Greek class I'd ever taught, and a student came up to me with a paper wanting to argue for a view. And that often happens to me as a Greek teacher, where someone will have a strange view and they want to use the Greek to bolster their strange view. And his name was Dave, and I said, Dave, what's this paper about? And he said, it's about the date of Revelation. And I knew that everyone teaches that Revelation was written in 96, around 96 AD. And I said, well, when do you argue? And he said, well, I argue pre-70 date. And just in my kind of naive thing, I thought to myself, oh no, this is one of those papers, somebody arguing. And so I said, well, Dave, I believe if, you have a view that's right, you'd have ancient, medieval, modern commentary, people who believe that. I said, who believes it was written before 70 AD? And he said, well, Athanasius, Augustine, F.F. Bruce. And he starts going through a list of kind of who's who. And I thought, I didn't know that. So I was kind of interested. And I said, well, what about the seven hills, and I remember Dave asked me a question, and it just shook me. He said, the antagonist in Revelation, kind of this bad figure, is the great whore of Babylon. That if you take the 96, that's going to be Rome, right? And then Dave asked me a question. He said, in the Bible, what city was married to God and committed adultery? Then he asked the question, in fact, who's the only city ever to commit adultery against God? And I had to admit, I went from, wow, this is a weird view, to maybe I should read Dave's paper. In the process of that, I noticed this days of vengeance, right? Luke says that these are the days of vengeance. Where does that phrase come from in the Bible? Deuteronomy 32:35, vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand, their doom comes swiftly. Who's that talking about? That's talking about the people who have broken God's covenant. These are the covenant curses. Hosea 9:7, the days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. This is God's covenantally unfaithful people. And in Revelation, when we look at the date, we're going to see that this mega whore, is what she's called, is contrasted with the virgin daughter of Zion. And what it is God's unfaithful people and the people that God has made faithful, not pagan Rome. And I remember Dave asked me, when was Rome ever married to God? Rome was never married to God. So when it talks about this porne megale, I mean, just type that in. Where does that appear? It appears in Hosea. It appears in Isaiah of Jerusalem. Jeremiah 46:10, this is the day the Lord of hosts, a day of vengeance. What is Jeremiah talking about? He's talking about God's vengeance on covenantally unfaithful people. We've talked about the Christian flight to Pella. These are my notes. I told you, shortest pencil better than the longest memory. But if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are talking primarily about the destruction of the temple, then that means we could have a hopeful eschatology. Why is Jesus warning about an event to the disciples not to be deceived when his coming ends the world? Why does he say you will see? Why does he say the kingdom of God is near? Why does he say keep watch? Now, that's the case for. What about the hardest verses? Well, this gospel must be preached to all the nations. That's a hard verse. But notice Colossians, and we had that. I didn't remember 1 Timothy 3:16. We confess the mystery of godliness. He is manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory. And I haven't pasted these yet, but these are similar verses. The sun darkened, moon to blood, that's a promised one. But you do have this passage in Isaiah that's using that same imagery of the destruction of Babylon in 539. Coming with the clouds of heaven, that's problematic. It is quoting Daniel 7, and there the coming isn't of the Son of Man to earth, rather it's the coming of the Son of Man to God in vindication. You do have this problematic verse of the angels will gather. So, evangelicals who hold to partial preterism, France is one. This is his commentary on Mark, I believe. And R.C. Sproul wrote a whole book called The Last Days According to Jesus, where he's trying to defend partial preterism. So, would you agree that this is a hard text? Do you realize that this hard text is... Remember how at the beginning of this class we said there are 5 different responses to hard text? Here, I'll pull this up. So you should have access to all of these through that Dropbox link. There are 5 ways that people deal with hard texts. One is that the Bible isn't true. Do you realize that many people come to the New Testament and say the New Testament teaching of the parousia expected the parousia within the first generation, and that did not happen, therefore the Bible isn't true? Do you realize that many people make that argument? Well, they do. A lot of people come to the parousia text and say the Bible is flawed but true. Yes, the New Testament writers all believe that parousia would happen within the generation. It didn't happen. The Bible is not true, but you can still believe it on a spiritual level. Karl Barth kind of took that view. Evangelicals typically do 3 things. One is ignore the difficulties. And that's very easy to do, isn't it? Kind of just focus on what's clear and just don't ever dive into what's unclear. I've grown up in that. And that's great until somebody starts pointing out the difficulties, and then it's like somebody just hits you in the knees with a baseball bat because, like, what do I do? Then you can try to inadequately solve the difficulties. That is, you give a suggestion. And I don't think we're here now with this difficult text. I think we're just kind of in the weeds. It's like, okay, there's a problem, there's a possibility, I don't know. But a lot of people will come and say, oh, well, this is just futurism, and it's about the coming of the end of the world, and this generation is this race. That just doesn't resonate with me. It just doesn't seem, it doesn't explain the data to me. But I have to admit, I'm not here. I haven't come across the thing where I said, oh, this is how you understand it. So I'm still in the process. This is difficult. This is a cabinet that I'm building. It's not finished. It's on my workbench over there. I'm working on it, but it's not finished yet. I do think, though, if the possibility exists for kind of a happier eschatology, that is, if the eschatological discourse is talking about something in 70 AD, I can make beautiful sense of that. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters fill the sea. Sit in my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. Paul comes along and says, all your enemies. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters fill the sea or cover the sea. Waters completely cover the sea. Therefore, I'm expecting the earth to be completely covered with the knowledge of God. And then Isaiah 9, of the increase of his kingdom and of peace there will be no end. So that's how I've come to the place where I'm kind of a tentative postmillennialist. But I'm going to say to my brothers and sisters who hold to a different view, I get why you come down to a different place, because there are plenty of passages that give me pause. I think in the evangelical world, I became a Christian in 1981. And in 1981, you couldn't really be an evangelical Christian if you weren't a premillennial dispensationalist. I mean, that's almost what it meant to be an evangelical. And lots of schools used to have part of their doctrinal statement premillennialism, some even dispensational premillennialism. Brian has never done that. Brian has always allowed people to have different views, which, having taught here 16 years now, I'm very thankful, because there are other conservative places where I couldn't sign the doctrinal statement because on that one issue, I came down on a slightly different way. Carlos, I think one of the seminaries you were looking at, Western Conservative, I think they used to have a statement about premillennialism, and they don't anymore. So it seems to me that the evangelical world has shifted to allow non-premillennial views, but premillennialism still is the majority view. So take all of this with a grain of salt and realize that good people have held different position. It is kind of an odd thing to me that William Jennings Bryan had a eschatological position. Do you know what he was? So he was a postmillennialist. So everybody thought he had lost his mind. After World War I, nobody's a postmillennialist anymore. But William Jennings Bryan was postmillennialist, and so I get to be the token postmillennialist most people will ever interact with. So I'm glad Brian found a place for me, and I'm glad that we can look at these. But it is a difficult view. And it all depends on how do you deal with the technical words in the eschatological discourse. I lean toward partial preterism, but hold it with an open hand. I'm more than willing to be corrected. You've seen the evidence. So, questions or comments or observations, or we're going to look at the date of Revelation, and then after a couple times on that, we're going to look at the very difficult passages from the Thessalonian correspondence. So we're not finished with this, but any observations or just questions, what we've done so far. I think there's a very pastoral reason to be postmillennialist, because I think you tell people, look, Jesus is going to win, and it isn't that he's going to win. He's going to win with his bride. It's why Paul says, I know that God will quickly crush Satan under your feet. He's taking the passage from Joseph's, 3:15, and he's applying it to the church. I think the church is going to participate in the triumph, and so I believe the day will come when Hollywood is Christian, when Iraq is Christian, when Tibet is Christian, because I believe the day will come when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters fill the sea. That's the minority view. The majority view is things are going to continue to get much worse. And I think things could get worse in America. I have no, pie in the sky belief that just things are going to immediately turn Christian. I think they could get a lot worse in America. But there are more people coming to Christ today than ever have any time in the world. It's just not in the first world countries. It's in Africa. It's in other nations, and it could be that God is going to bless those nations, and they end up sending missionaries to us to convert us. I wouldn't be surprised, but I think of the increase of his kingdom, there will be no end. So I think pastorally, you say, look, we're going to win. The day's going to come when our secular institutions are Christian again. The day's going to come when Christ is honored throughout culture. And that's not happened yet, so fight. Fight and pray and live in the strength of Jesus. And take the passages to God and plead with God to be true to his word. I think that's very pastoral, but I could be wrong. You be the jury. You decide. You be a Berean. You see for yourself what you think Scripture is saying. So what we're going to do now, I think we're going to do 2 times on the date of the book of Revelation. So all of this partial preterism stuff is tied up with when you date the book of Revelation. If the book of Revelation is written in 96, then partial preterism is wrong. It's just not right. If the book of Revelation is written later, postmillennialism isn't a possibility. So we want to look at the evidence. When do you date Revelation? And it isn't just, kind of an esoteric point. This is a real point, because if you can prove that Revelation is written later than any kind of 70 AD interpretation, just is wrong. So that's what we're going to take 2 times and look at that, and then we'll finally go into the really difficult thing of the Thessalonian passages. So everybody good where we're going to go? You may want to read some in Revelation. I'm not requiring it. But read through, and we'll come through next time, and we'll work on this together. All right. So I'll see you then.